Okay, so I imagine by now you've heard a few days ago a big investigation came out, and it raised questions about Buffy Sainte-Marie and her claim to Indigenous ancestry. Today on the podcast, you're going to hear from Indigenous artists. We're going to talk about whether this changes Buffy's place as an icon. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This is Commotion. Okay, so today on Commotion, we are talking about Buffy Sainte-Marie. As you can imagine, this is a hard conversation to have, but it's a conversation that we have to have. This is happening after an investigation by the CBC's Fifth Estate called into question Buffy's claims to Indigenous ancestry. And the playwright Drew Hayden Taylor said it best. I think he said it's a cosmic shift in the Indigenous universe. Black is white, up is down. I would say that it is impossible to generalize or summarize the reaction to this story or the impact that it's having. But this morning, we're going to try to work through it with two artists who have known Buffy Sainte-Marie for a long time. ShoShona Kish is an Anishinaabekwe musician and community organizer, originally from Batchwa First Nation in Ontario. And Michelle Good is a writer, a poet, and a member of the Red Pheasant Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. ShoShona, Michelle, welcome to Commotion.
Thanks for...
Of course. Listen, I want to make it clear, I'm not asking either one of you to surgically dissect this story, the Fifth Estate investigation. That's not what we're going to do here. What I want you to do is just share your own reaction to this massively complex story. And to just recap, the investigation showed that Buffy was born to two white parents in the small town of Massachusetts, not on the Piapat First Nation in Saskatchewan as she had claimed for most of her life. ShoShona, maybe I'll start with you. You're speaking to us from Spain right now. You're at a global music conference with Indigenous musicians from all over the world, including many from this country. If you don't mind taking me to that moment for you when you first heard that this story was going to come out.
Yeah, I think that, like for all of us, perhaps this hit really hard for me. I think my first feeling was panic on behalf of our community. Because Buffy has been such a North Star for us in so many ways. And I think that we're all moving in the world in some way as beneficiaries of the work and trailblazing that she's done. So, I think that it really shook me up. A friend of mine asked me, like, how's this hitting? And I was like, I think it's somewhere around an 8 on the Richter scale for me.
Oh, wow. Panic is an interesting word, right? Because it's sort of, it evokes a sort of full body response in a way. So the idea that all of your senses have to respond to this thing. You've been huddling with people for the past few days. How is this story landing among other Indigenous musicians who have gathered for the summit that you're at?
I think that what I'm hearing largely from the artists that are here with me is, this real sense of protectiveness. For anti-Buffy and a real sense of distaste for the way that the Fifth Estate and CBC chose to handle this conversation. So we've been having a lot of discussions about that because, we've been talking about irresponsible journalism. We've been talking about objectivity. We've been talking about, what does truth mean? And then, of course, just thinking about how best to take care of each other, because it really, I think that I think a lot of people are experiencing grief.
I want to come back to a lot of those themes that you just mentioned, but let me just get Michelle in here. Michelle, I'm going to share a moment from this documentary that we're talking about.
All right.
Buffy's 1982 marriage certificate, which she signed, says the following. She was born on February 20th, 1941 to Albert and Winifred Santamaria in Massachusetts. And yet, in a 2018 interview with US-based National Public Radio, Buffy claimed she didn't know when she was born.
Do you know your birthday?
No, I don't.
Michelle, how do you feel taking all of this in?
When the whispers first started, just before the release of the Fifth Estate story, the only way I could describe how I felt was heartsick. Because as we've heard, Buffy is Buffy. She's this icon. She's a woman who broke down barriers for Indigenous people, as well as being somebody that we could look to as an example and as encouragement that we too could strive and succeed in whatever areas that we chose in a world that tries to reject us regularly and historically. And so, and I continue to feel heartsick and sad in many ways, mostly for our people, but also sad for Buffy in the sense that, what has moved her to make these decisions over the course of her life. And, she's 82 years old. Mm-hmm. And I pick up on ShoShona's point about responsible journalism, and did this have to come out at this time? Did it have to come out in this way? And who is benefiting from this approach to basically deconstructing this very important person? Mm-hmm. But the one thing that I really want to say is that I think people are responding as though the whole thing was a lie, that all of the feelings I had about Buffy are now, debunked or taken away. And they're not. When you stood in a concert with Buffy going wild with her, amazing music and her amazing presentation, your feeling was real. That was real. You don't have to give up that feeling that you had. You don't have to give up your admiration for the talent and for the encouragement that she gave Indigenous people. You don't have to give that up. Now, Buffy has some work to do in terms of sorting all of this out, but we don't. We can still have those feelings. We don't have to choose to be hurt by this.
ShoShona, I'm hearing from both of you. I think the struggle in navigating both that. In this particular instance, is this something that you would want to know versus not want to know? And I think on balance, to me, you would do the story. One would do the story, because if one comes to you and says one of the North Stars of Indigenous artistry in this country, their claim to Indigenous ancestry raises some questions, that's worth investigating. I think in terms of the approach, I think I've heard from a lot of Indigenous people who've said, actually, the approach was not the right one, or at least we feel that the approach was not the right one. I'm aware that we are on CBC airwaves at the moment, but I'm not even necessarily speaking for the corporation here. I'm just kind of curious myself about how do you treat something that has this magnitude in a sensitive way? How do you feel it should have been approached? Because that is one of the touch points of this is like, okay, even if it's a story, how do you go about it? So in your view, how do you go about it?
Well, I think that I'll preface this with, a teaching that I've received from my mother and, has evolved in my own ability to understand it. But the word for truth in Anishinaabekwe is dibwe. And what my mom says is that you cannot have facts without kindness and call it truth. And I think that, this has such great consequence for us as as a collective, as Indigenous people and as Canadians. And I would have expected Fifth Estate to not treat it like tabloid television. I felt like I was watching TMZ or something, and I didn't see the objectivity. I didn't see the different points of view, the different paths of facts presented in a way that would allow the audience to sort of assess and decide for themselves. What I saw was like a very, it was just like this expose, and I felt like it had very little sense of responsibility to that, which I would hold the Fifth Estate to in terms of investigative journalism. I was offended, and I think that I'm not interested in having a conversation about whether Buffy is Indigenous, honestly, because she was adopted in cultural protocol by the Piapot Nation, and we are sovereign nations and we can decide our own citizenship. So maybe we're talking about whether Buffy was honest with us about her, origin stories, but we're not talking about her indigeneity, because that part is very clear, and leadership from that community and her family from that community have made that clear to us.
I find I have to disagree with that point just a little bit, no offense. You know, I agree 100% that this is a deeply nuanced situation. And Buffy was adopted into that community according to Cree protocol. I'm Cree. I live just next door. And that is valid and important and true. But that doesn't make her Indigenous. And that's a point that Jean Teye makes in the Fifth Estate, and is something that I've given a lot of consideration to. It makes her adopted. It makes her a valid, complete, and, you know, total member of that community, but it doesn't change whether she is Indigenous or not. She, you know, if in fact she's has no Indigenous blood, she's not Indigenous. She's adopted. And in my book, in my recent book, Truth Telling, 7 Conversations about Indigenous Life in Canada, there's an essay in there called Cultural Pillagers, where I do an analysis of pretendianism and how to maybe give it consideration in light of community protocols. And I found this wonderful analogy drawing on the notion of Indigenous plants. And the Audubon Society defines an Indigenous plant as a plant that existed in North America prior to European colonization. They also define a naturalized plant as a plant that has been welcomed into the ecosystem without doing any harm. And then they define the invasive species, which are, you know, the species that have come and are destroying the ecosystem. Okay. And so in following that analogy, the adoption of Buffy makes her naturalized, makes her welcomed, makes her a part of the ecosystem, but does not make her Indigenous. And I think that's really challenging and an expression of how nuanced this question is, because she can't be simply, rejected as having a place in the Indigenous world because of those protocols and because she was welcomed and adopted according to those protocols. But it doesn't make her Indigenous. And as Jean Teye said, you know, could she have done this without having done it in redface? And I think that's an important question. But I also think, is the question really answered? Has she had the opportunity to say, this is why I signed the marriage certificate? Okay. How many of us have just signed something because we needed to get something done? I think more information needs to come forward. And I felt that the Fifth Estate fell down by not having her present in the conversation.
I do have to say that Buffy Sainte-Marie is refuting the Fifth Estate's allegations, and it's my understanding that the Fifth Estate reached out to Buffy and they did not receive a comment back. And so when she released that video, and we heard her from her own words, that was the first time that she was responding to some of the content that was in this. Michelle, that analogy is really powerful, and I actually want to just like sit with that for a moment. This idea about like these different types of plants. But maybe, ShoShona, if you don't mind, I want to play you a part of an interview that you did with Buffy just a few months ago. Let's just roll that clip right now.
We who have been adopted away, scooped away, some of us who have been born on the wrong side of the blanket, you know, some of us who are really unknowledgeable about our backgrounds because nobody would tell us. We grow up with a kind of insecurity, not knowing how to react to things. And this is something that a lot of us are going through. And I'm really glad now that people are starting to talk about that, because our identity as Indigenous people or mixed blood people, or shoot, some of us don't even know, we are a community, and that's part of it. And we have to help each other to be ourselves, to share ourselves, whoever we are. Yeah. And now there's a whole lot of stuff about blood quantum and all, you know, and there's lineage. And so it's a complicated issue we need to be sharing and helping each other with.
ShoShona, there's a lot of we in that sentence, right? She's so clearly sort of including herself among those who were stolen away, who were scooped away. I think listening to her speak in that moment, what occurred to you even back then?
I thought what she was saying was really interesting and compelling in the context of the identity conversation that we're having.
Right.
And, you know, and I think that it is exactly these kinds of statements that I think people are picking up on. And in terms of this idea of pretendians asking questions, and so,
right.
And the thing is, I think that in some ways, I think maybe it's possible right now that we're going to have a healthier conversation around this, because I don't know that we are collectively having the kind of conversation we could, bringing forward, our teachings to guide us in the way that we behave with each other, in the way that we build relationships, in the way that we question, important things. We have to have critical discussion around the things that are important to our nations. Maybe once again, Buffy is going to be a catalyst for change for us. And it's like, oh my goodness. And, like race is a colonial construct. Blood quantum is a colonial construct. I really hope that we come back to our own teachings to guide us through this and help us know who we are and where we stand together. And that certainly doesn't mean we have to agree, because the diversity of opinions is part of what makes for a healthy circle. And I don't think we should be telling each other what to think either. I know that Buffy has done an incredible amount of work for our community. And I know that she has made this world better, not just for Indigenous people, but for everyone. So I hope that we carry forward, the appropriate kindness and respect as we continue to discuss this.
There's I'm in an uncomfortable position because I'm the person asking you these questions. I'm the person who invited you to have this conversation in the first place. And so much of this conversation I've noticed, ShoShona, has been just like with your face literally in your hands. So I just want to just acknowledge how difficult this is, because as much as we've had a lot of different conversations about pretendians, about people who sort of try to hijack the Indigenous identity for different benefits, it's a different thing when we're talking about Buffy, or at least it seems to be a different thing when we're talking about Buffy, because, as you mentioned earlier, she is this sort of North Star. What are the emotions coming up for you as you keep sort of navigating through this? Is it something that you're like, I want to sit deeper into it, or are you trying to like move on past it? What's coming up for you?
Well, I will say, given the headlines in the world right now, I'm concerned about us turning away from like the really critical life and death things that are happening. And I'm deeply concerned about what our global family is going through. That said, this is, I've been like, where do we place all of these really challenging things? Like, how much time and space is it appropriate to be having this conversation when perhaps our singular focus should be peace in the Middle East, at this moment, but I really want to have the conversation because I deeply love and respect my community. And I think part of the grief that I'm feeling is, I think about the young people who knew that they could be brilliant because they saw how brilliant Buffy is. And we as a community we are so brilliant, but so few of us have had the opportunity to grow up with these, shining stars in all of the places that are standing next to, their global colleagues from around the world and shining. And we should be there and we will be there. But I worry that, the pervasive story that, maybe sometimes it's subterranean, maybe it's overt, but the racist story that we get told about who we are is still present. And that we are less than, and I think I want us to be able to see ourselves in the most brilliant ways. And, I know many young people who were inspired to a life in the arts because of Buffy.
Yeah.
Because, and because they believed they could, because they believed that they were brilliant. And I want us to continue to have that.
Earlier, ShoShona talked about turning to the teaching that truth is not just facts, it's facts plus kindness. Like that is one of the teachings that she's drawing on. Are there any teachings that you're drawing on that in terms of navigating this question?
Well, I think that, it's in the same vein of what ShoShona is talking about, and that I feel that we all need to tap into our sense of compassion in this. And also, as I said earlier, that our responses to Buffy's presence in the world doesn't have to be negated by this story okay, or this change in story, if you will. We had those experiences. We were encouraged. We were uplifted. And all of those things are real. It doesn't go away. You know, and also, as, you know, ShoShona is saying about, you know, her being such a positive example for folks. But, you know, there was also the question of that Juno Award that she won for Best Indigenous Album.
And in 2018, that's right.
Well, and the point is taking space, right? You know, it's just so nuanced, and I think we have to sit with it with love, with respect, with compassion, with kindness, and at the same time honoring the truth, but at the same time as well, you know, leaving a space for Buffy to respond in a fulsome way.
ShoShona, one of the things that I'm sort of realizing is that, like, reacting to the story with such a short turnaround time is actually, like, maybe not even a reasonable ask. And, you know, and I appreciate you being here to do that. Maybe we can zoom out a little bit and talk about Buffy's influence and impact for a moment. Just talk about Buffy's influence and impact and why the story is so resonant with so many people, why it's so difficult for so many people. To Indigenous people who were growing up with Buffy at a time when there were simply no other Indigenous celebrities on the world stage, what did she mean to you?
I mean, Buffy was like this, you know, well, I was trying to think about how to encapsulate like the breadth of her influence and
a force of nature.
Sorry, what was that, Michelle?
A force of nature.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. You know, I think that in some ways, like, it's impossible to, because her influence has been so almost like ubiquitous. It has touched us in so many ways, as in terms of activism, in terms of art, in terms of education. You know, I think that, you know, I was very inspired by her work, being able to sort of bring some of these things together, like be an artist, but also, you know, work in a community building respect. And I think, you know, see the power of being able to see yourself on a stage through seeing, you know, this incredible person up there is, you can't overstate it. I mean, it allows something to be possible when you see it that way.
Right.
And I think I'm hearing this criticism about the Junos. The reason that we have an Indigenous category is in some large part due to Auntie Buffy's work to start that category in the first place. And I remember being a very young woman when they announced that category and going to a celebration. And, you know, there were a number of people that worked, but Buffy was a very important part of that. You know, these platforms that we enjoy now, many of them she had a hand in. So I think I feel like, you know, I love her. I appreciate her. I'm so grateful for her. So this is a real tough one for me. And I also know, like, Michelle, I totally agree. Like, this story is not done. And I know we've seen some facts here. My own mother doesn't know what her birth date was. My grandmother didn't know what her birth date was.
Right.
Kind of colonial records were not kept in the same way. I know there are folks saying that there were really great records kept, but that is not the evidence that I've seen in my own family. We had, and there's a number of other things, you know, around how adoptions were handled that we're seeing so many of our relatives bravely sharing, you know, very personal stories online about how their records were kept. So I think we need to keep ourselves open to hearing many sides to this and maybe there are things we will never know, but I certainly am open to hearing how this story evolves.
Michelle, how do you feel hearing that from ShoShona?
I couldn't agree more. But I think the other thing that makes this so difficult with Buffy is the person that she is. You know, I've met Buffy a few times, and I called her or emailed her to ask her if I could, you know, use some of her lyrics from Starwalker in my novel, in Five Little Indians. And, you know, and I said, you may not remember me. No, she said, of course I remember you. Remember we had this conversation, da 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 da. Every single person she ever met, I swear to God, she remembered them. And I mean, in addition to her phenomenal talent, she was such a warm, caring human being. And as people say, she's our auntie. You know, she's our kokum. I guess the point I really want to make more than anything is your experiences with Buffy are real, regardless of the outcome of the investigation. That joy you felt, that courage you chose, all of that is not rendered unreal by this. And I want people to take comfort in that.
Last year, hundreds of people filled the National Arts Centre in Ottawa for this tribute to Buffy Sainte-Marie. ShoShona, you are one of the many Indigenous performers on that stage, celebrating all these enormous contributions that she's made. I want you to listen to some of what you said.
Buffy Sainte-Marie has led the way for Indigenous music on this beautiful land since her first album 58 years ago. But who she is and what she means to us is more than the superlatives and the accolades. She is an example of the limitless bounds of the human spirit and the endless possibilities when we stand in courage and love. She is hope. She is inspiration. And she is our North Star. Chimigwech Buffy, thank you for all that you have given us. It is a great honor to be celebrating with you tonight, and we love you.
Yeah.
Our North Star. ShoShona, how does that moment and the words that you spoke then, how does that land with you now? Has anything changed?
No, nothing has changed for me. But, I'm just the kind of human I am. I'm just like, if I love you forever. And I might be angry and I might get hurt. And, all sorts of messy things might happen. But if you're my person, you're my person. And so Buffy is my person. I'm reserving any judgment until I actually have a chance to speak with Buffy herself.
She's in our hearts and she's in our lives and she's in our story, right? And everything comes down to story. And that just doesn't change.
I'm going to ask both of you a question, and we sort of plan on ending this question, but now hearing both of your thoughts, it occurs to me that either both or one of you might feel, you know what, this is not a really fair question. It's not a really fair question to end on this question. So if it's not a fair question, you let me know. You say, Elamin, this is not the time for this question. But you both know Buffy personally. Let's imagine she's listening to this conversation right now. Is there something that you want to tell her that you're comfortable saying here? Maybe Michelle, I'll start with you.
Thanks.
Not that it's easy to start with you, but
that's definitely a tough question. Yeah. And I guess I just want to say that I wish her peace and some way of coming through this in a way that is not hurtful to her or to the Indigenous population.
ShoShona, what about you?
Well, I think that I would say, Buffy, we love you. And your legacy is safe with us.
Yes.
I think that is a perfect place to leave it. ShoShona, Michelle, listen, I appreciate both of you being here. I also just want to say, this felt like maybe I didn't need to be here at all. Maybe you guys should be speaking to one another about this because
would have been good.
And I mean that genuinely. I really, I mean that genuinely because I'm here to sort of pose these questions, but I think the things that you had to say, it felt like eavesdropping on a really difficult conversation, and I'm really grateful for the intimacy and the generosity that you both have brought to this. So, Michelle, ShoShona, thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Chimigwech Michelle. It was lovely to talk to you, even under these circumstances.
Likewise. Thanks so much for being here. Strengthens me and gives me some more insight too. Thank you.
Chimigwech.
ShoShona Kish is an Anishinaabe musician and half of the duo Digging Roots. She's from Batchwa First Nation in Ontario. And Michelle Good is a writer, poet, and member of the Red Pheasant Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and you're listening to Commotion. Look, before we go, I'm sure a lot of you heard the news or maybe saw it on your feeds this weekend. The Matthew Perry died. Gonna be honest with you, when I saw the news alert, I genuinely couldn't believe it. Like, it is just so sad. He was only 54 years old. This is coming about a year or so after he released his memoir. I think something that is hard about this is that, yes, of course, Matthew Perry was Chandler Bing on Friends. I get it. That is going to be the first thing that comes to mind. That is a character that we spend 10 seasons with. We got the chance to know Chandler really well. But Matthew Perry did so much more than that. For one, my favorite Matthew Perry performance is like from this Aaron Sorkin show. It's called Studio 60 on the Sunset Strip. It's the first show that he did after Friends. They only made one season of it, but it is utterly brilliant, and he's totally and completely brilliant in that show as well. But maybe more importantly, outside of acting, Matthew Perry was someone who, later in his life, he wore his heart on his sleeve. He was honest about all of it. We're talking about the alcoholism, the drugs, everything. And on top of that, he wanted to help. Matthew Perry opened a rehab clinic in Malibu to help men stop drinking. He also wrote a play about all these struggles that he was going through so that others could learn about what he went through as well. Last year, Matthew Perry talked a bit about this on Q with Tom Power. Here's a little bit of what he said.
For so long, I didn't know what was going on. I do now. And that's why the best thing about me is I can help people if they ask me to. I can... Wonderful things happen in my life. I'm incredibly grateful for all of them. But that's the ticket for me, is helping people on a large scale or helping, one guy and seeing the light turn on and him understanding what is happening.
The best thing about me is that I can help people. That's a beautiful thing to know about yourself. That's Matthew Perry on Q last November when his memoir came out. Matthew Perry died this weekend. He was 54 years old. We're going to talk a lot more about this on tomorrow's podcast. There's so much to get into. I hope you'll listen then. In the meantime, that is it for the show today. Remember, you can listen to any episode of the show wherever you get your podcasts. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. I'm going to be here tomorrow, and I hope to see you then.